Alright, so today we are testing Pax Dei with the RTX 4070 Super. That is paired with a 14600 KF CPU. That again is paired with DDR5 6400 megatransfers per second CL32 memory. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, Pax Dei literally just released. It's in early access at the moment, and it's kind of like a crafting MMO. It does have some survival elements, but it's mostly crafting. Like, as far as I can see, there's no hunger or thirst or anything like that. Anyway, so let me just go over the settings here with you quickly. There's not a lot. So we've got overall quality, low, medium, and high, and that's pretty much it. And then we do have upscaling and frame generation. That's it. The only thing I can tell you about this game is that it does run in Unreal Engine 5, and the performance shows it. All right, so we'll be testing at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. So let's drop this down to 1080p and get testing. Right, we're at 1080p full screen, and just to show you, you've got DLSS, FSR, and TSR, and I just set DLSS to off. There's no other native selection here. I mean, FSR is also upscaling, and TSR, it's also temporal super resolution, so also an upscaler. Anyway, so let's just disable frame generation and leave everything else on the high quality. Right, so I just started with this game, and I especially selected one of the starting regions where there's a lot of woods, and I'm not entirely sure how demanding this game actually is. As I said, it just launched and I just started playing. So I'm just going to run around in the woods here to see what the performance is like. Remember, this is 1080p native, and we are barely getting 60 frames per second. So, I mean, I say barely, but 10% above 60 frames per second. Not a very good experience, this, and the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows especially are very, very low, and that's because there's a lot of stuttering. I mean, this is an Unreal Engine 5 game, as I alluded to earlier, and it definitely has all the hallmarks of an Unreal Engine 5 game as well. I haven't even killed anything yet. Let's see if I can actually fight. I might die, yeah, because okay, I'm gonna die. So the one major disadvantage for me with this game is that I have to play in Europe servers, and I'm in South Africa. The input latency, or the network latency, is horrible, so that's not ideal. Anyway, so once again, this is an early access game. I'm not bashing it at all. It's just, it was expensive. It was almost $50 here where I live, and you'd expect a more playable experience. Personally, like, the stuttering to me is the biggest issue. As long-time viewers of the channel know, I'm heavily opposed to stuttering. All right, so that was 1080p on the high preset. So let's just drop this down to medium. We'll go through the presets and then we'll start with the upscaling. All right, so just on the medium preset, we were getting around 71 frames per second. All right, so in this specific area, not a lot of gain in the frame rate there. The stuttering might increase, or the stuttering might improve, I must say, because as I said, it's Unreal Engine 5, and it does have a lot of traversal stutter and shader compilation stutter. There's not a shader compilation step. So if you do something for the first time or traverse an area for the first time, there will be a stutter. And you can see now that the stuttering, even though the 0.1% lows are still pretty bad, there are still some stutters. It's definitely much better. So the second time you pass through a specific area, it'll be much better. So I just want to get back to where I started. I think it's this way. I did not really notice. Anyway, so got an average there of 75 frames per second, or 1% lows of 53. It changes all the time, and our 0.1% lows are sitting at 8. Alright, so on the low preset, we are getting a very, very big boost to our frame rate. The game still doesn't look terrible, but there is a lot of pop-in. It's not the best looking Unreal Engine 5 game by a long shot. I'm not smoking, I'm just laughing. I do enjoy making these videos. The foliage and stuff still looks plenty good. We might see some issues with the lighting and shadows now, especially in the forest area, but it does seem like dropping down to low is not the worst when it comes to the visual experience, but it is actually much better when it comes to the frame rate. Right, so the sun rays and shadows still look okay. I mean, I'm not pixel peeping at all. I'm just playing the game as most people would. If you go and pixel peep, you'll definitely see some issues. But surprisingly, our 0.1% layers are very, very stable at 66 at the moment. So that's pretty good. We're not running out of VRAM either. We're sitting at 6 gigabytes of VRAM usage. So that's definitely not the reason for the better 0.1% layers. Anyway, so I'm just going to go back to the high preset, enable DLSS quality, and then we'll enable frame generation as well. All right, so just for reference, I'm on the high preset. You can see the shadows are definitely much better. So we are sitting at 70 frames per second here. So let's just go ahead and enable DLSS. I'm just going to leave the overlay open. So just DLSS set to quality. It should improve our frame rate in real time. So there we go. So we've got 100 frames per second there. Let's see if we are CPU bound. We go to balanced. We're still not CPU bound. What about performance? We still see an increase in the frame rate, so not CPU bound at all. All right, so let's leave it on quality. Let's see what kind of performance we're getting, because I do think that DLSS set to quality at 1080p is probably as low as I personally go, and then we'll test with frame generation and move to 1440p. Now it's running in the same spot here. You can already see that the stuttering is less, the 0.1% lows are better, and like my benchmark runs aren't, that's going to be dangerous. My benchmark runs aren't fully scientific, right? I just want to show you what kind of performance you can get just by playing the game. If I do a 3-run average, the 0.1% lows would be much better, but I do think that that's not indicative of what your experience would be like, right? Because due to the traversal stutter and the shadow compilation stutter, it won't be present in the second and third run. So whereas with your first run, it will definitely be there. So getting a nice average here of 95 frames per second, although it is with the DLSS set to quality at 1080p, so 720p internal resolution on a 4070 Super. It's not ideal at all. All right, so let's just enable frame generation. We'll move on to 1440p. Right, so getting around 100 frames per second here. So frame generation on, and we saw a nice boost or bump to 130, but it's stabilized to 120. What's happening here? Right, so back. I just had to restart the game. I just wanted to make sure that the 120 frames per second cap was not due to VSync or anything on my side. So you can see there we do have some somewhat accurate reflections. Anyway, so it's now dark. Obviously there is some time of day stuff on the server itself, so I can't change that. But you can see here we are locked to 120 frames per second for some reason. Probably a game engine cap perhaps, and so here we are, 120 frames per second, sitting at 1080p on the high preset with a frame generation enabled and DLSS set to quality, right? So you can still see that now after the reboot, our 0.1% lows are pretty terrible. Once again, there is a lot of stuttering again, and that just solidifies my reasoning that it is traversal and shadow compilation stutters, because after a reboot of the game, it would have to recompile all these shaders and stuff again. Anyway, so we are sitting at 120 frames per second cap, and Black Bear is chasing us. Just want to get away from the Black Bear quickly, and then we'll move on to 1440p. Right, so here we are at 1440p high with no DLSS, no frame generation, and let's see what the performance is like, and it's pretty dismal. Now, I'm not entirely sure what kind of Unreal Engine 5 features this game actually uses. I don't think it uses nanite. The ground geometry does not look impressive enough for it to be nanite. It might use Lumen. That's probably the only thing I can think of why the performance is so heavy. Remember, most Unreal Engine 5 games actually use Lumen, which is software ray tracing, right? So it's not as heavy as most hardware ray traced implementations, obviously depending on what kind of implementation it is. I mean, path tracing surpasses everything in that regard. But yeah, you can see we are getting an average of 50 frames per second, give or take, and our 0.1% lows are sitting at 18, which is pretty bad. So we'll just go through the presets again, high, medium, and low, and then we'll move on to DLSS and frame generation. Now, the nice thing here is you can actually see the frame rate change slightly when you change the settings. So if we go to low, we are then getting 65 frames per second, but there's no big difference between high and low. So if we go high, which is 48, 49, and the medium is then 50, 51. Okay, so no real change in the frame rate really. If you are planning to play at medium, just play at high. So our VRAM usage is not that high either. We are sitting just below 8 gigabytes of VRAM, which is good news for 8 gigabyte VRAM GPUs. You can play at 1440p on the medium preset without having to worry so far. It might run out of VRAM in the long run. I'm not sure. Now, once again, I'm really not bashing the performance here. This is an early access game, but as I said earlier, I paid almost $50 for this game, and if you do that, you have to know that you are buying into an early access title, right? But you'd still want something playable for $50 at least. I mean, that's how I feel. Not that this is unplayable, but the stuttering does get quite annoying. Just have a look at the frame time graph there. It really does paint a grim picture. All right, so that's 1440p medium. I'm going to leave this open here. So let's just drop this to low. We go from 47 to 58 frames per second in the specific spot. So let's reset our numbers. So we're not able to hit 60 frames per second at all times at 1440p low, right? It does, I mean, it does depend on which area you are. This is pretty intensive. Like, I'm not entirely sure if there are more demanding areas in this game. There probably are, but I chose the wooded areas because due to all the foliage, the shadows, and the light rays, that kind of stuff, it is generally more demanding in games, right? So that's why I test in the wooded areas. And you can see we are running at 60 frames per second. We've got a 61% or 61 frames per second average there, but our 0.1% lows are pretty terrible once again. So I think I'm just going to switch it to high. Like, high with the DLSS should be fine, I think. Hopefully that buck does not attack. So if we go to the high preset again, you'll see we drop into the high 40s there. And then if we enable DLSS set to quality, that goes to 70 frames per second. All right, this is actually not too terrible. It's playable. Like, if you are aiming for 60 frames per second, this should probably give you a locked 60 frames per second experience, at least in the area that I'm testing out. There's water as well. Let's just see how well these guys actually did the water. Remember, we are on the high preset. Can we swim? Oh, there we go. Okay. Not that impressive, but as I said, early access, a lot of things might change, but a lot of things might not change either. So, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt, and hopefully a lot of things do change. So just going to run around a little bit, and you can see our average error is sitting at 74 frames per second, and our 0.1% lows are still at 17. Like, that seems to be the magic number for our 0.1% lows. My GPU is a little bit toastier anyway. So let's just see what kind of performance gains we get from dropping down to balanced. I think 1440p balanced is decent enough. That's pretty much where I play most of my games, or most of the visually demanding games. With this 4070 Super, I just drop it to DLSS balance and enable frame generation, and now you will definitely be able to maintain above 60 frames per second at all times, it seems. So in the more open areas, we are almost hitting 90 at times, and then the more wooded areas, it drops. So you can look at around 80 frames per second, depending on where you are. If you're looking for a high frame rate, just build your base out there. All right, so 79 frames per second average here. DLSS set to balanced. Now I'm just going to drop this down, or go back to DLSS quality, and then enable frame generation here. All right, so we went up to 110 frames per second, and let's just see. Whoops, wrong buttons. There we go. So the frame time graph is a lot smoother, but we are still seeing those pretty big stutters. Our 0.1% lows are dropping into the 50s there, but it does seem slightly better. Once again, it's because I've been here before. If you restart the game and you start running here again, you'll start to see those stutters. The input latency is a bit more noticeable than I'd like personally, I try and aim for around 120 frames per second with frame generation enabled. So most times that would mean around 80 to 90 frames per second before enabling frame generation. Just look at the stuttering there in the frame time graph. Kind of annoying, but that's just Unreal Engine 5, right? So getting an average of 110 frames per second. Let's just see if we can actually hit 120 frames per second if we go with DLSS balanced. All right, there we go. So 120 frames per second, DLSS balanced. Let's just reset our numbers. And now we are slightly CPU bound because we are, not CPU bound, we're not fully utilizing the GPU because there's a frame rate cap of 120, and we seem to be hitting that more often than not, which is good to see. But even with frame generation, our 0.1% lows are taking a very, very big hit. We're sitting with the 12 frames per second there for the 0.1% lows. Our 1% lows aren't too terrible, but like hopefully it is one of the things they do pay a lot of attention to, and that's performance. Alright, so 120 frames per second is definitely achievable even on the high preset. Just use DLSS set to balanced and use frame generation. There we have it. Alright, let's move on to 4K. Right, we're at 4K, high preset, no DLSS and no frame generation. I don't think this is going to go well at all. Alright, sorry, I just wanted to make the on-screen display a little bit bigger. So here we are at 4K on the high preset native, getting 24 frames per second. So this GPU is definitely not a 4K GPU, right? You can definitely play games at 4K output, but you'll have to use upscaling for that. And this is no surprise that we're not even getting 30 frames per second here, although sometimes you just have to wonder whether the visuals actually justify the poor performance. I know that sure, games can be heavy, engines can be heavy, but sometimes you just really have to think, like, is it really 30 frames per second at 4K good? Like, I personally don't think so. That's my opinion. If you look at the grass, so sure, the foliage detail is very, very detailed, but the character models, etc., like they are definitely very basic. And as I said, let's just look at the leaves here. Like it definitely some low res textures here. So anyway, I'm not convinced that 30 frames per second is justifiable here. But once again, I'm going to reiterate this is an early access game. A lot can change. So let's see what it looks like on medium and then low. Let's see if we actually do see a performance difference here. My mouse pointer is gone. So if we're sitting with 22 frames per second, and now we are sitting with 23. Okay. So I'm not even going to be testing medium. Let's just test low, right? So we gained 4 frames per second, or actually 6 frames per second, but still not 30 frames per second at all. Like, sure, if we look up into the clouds, we get 30, and in this specific area we get 30. So if you want a 4K 30 native experience, then you just have to use the low preset. And you can see our VRAM usage is sitting at around 8 gigabytes. So your 8 gigabyte GPUs will not be able to run this. I mean, you won't be able to get playable frame rates out of it anyway, and it's not going to be the VRAM's fault. Anyway, so average of 34 frames per second, but just look at that frame time graph. Anyway, so let's see what kind of difference the DLSS actually makes here for us. Let's go to the high preset, okay? Because I do think that there's a big difference between low and high, but not that big a difference in the frame rate at 4K, right? So let's enable DLSS quality. I just want to see what boost or what increase the frame rate we get. Balanced, we get 50, and ultra performance. So ultra performance, we get 76. Let's just start off with the DLSS performance. Not 60 frames per second. Like, this GPU should be capable to do 60 frames per second at 4K with DLSS performance, right? Because its internal resolution is 1080p. Sure, there are overheads when it comes to DLSS upscaling, but this is just visually a very heavy game, and as I said, I personally don't think the visuals justify the performance. Although the lighting looks quite good and the shadows, etc., look quite good, there are definitely some redeeming qualities about this game's visuals. But then there are also other things that look extremely basic. So getting an average of 56 frames per second. Our 1% lows are sitting at 44 and our 0.1% lows are sitting at 10. So let's see if we then just drop this down to ultra performance. Let's see if we can maintain 60 frames per second. I think we should. And I think DLSS ultra performance here would be the only one where it will be viable to enable frame generation just because of the input latency. So 76 frames per second. It should be decent for frame generation, so let's go ahead and do that quickly. Actually, let me just get away from this bear again. All right, so over here, well, now it looks like it's getting light. So the frame rate does increase slightly, it seems. Anyway, so let's go ahead and enable frame generation here, sitting at 80 frames per second, and frame generation takes that up to 111 frames per second. Now this would be perfectly playable, I think, if we let's have a look at our render latency here. If we just have a look at our average PC latency, it should start showing up. It does not. It does not even detect the frame rate. This is the Nvidia app, by the way. So maybe this is the latest Nvidia driver, which does have support for Pax Dei, but for some reason the Nvidia app is not picking it up. The metrics is not picking it up anyway. All right, so that's kind of useless. Anyway, still getting in a very low 0.1% lows of 21 frames per second, but at least our average is sitting at 105 and our 1% lows are sitting at 76. The sky does look very, very good, especially at dawn. You can, it's not a gradual increase. You saw that it went from pink to orange in like a split second, but still, I don't think it's terrible. The clouds look pretty good, and the light coloring is pretty good as well. All right, so 100 frames per second, give or take. So let's just see if we go. This will be the last test or the last setting I want to test. So if we go with without frame generation, yeah, we are sitting. I just want to get to 4K balanced with 60 frames per second, right? So let's see if we go with medium preset. Actually, there's almost no difference between medium and high. So we've got 58 frames per second there, and medium is 59 frames per second. So the only difference in the performance comes in the form of low, and I personally don't think it's worth it. So, like, fine, let's get the 2 frames per second additional. Let's go with the DLSS performance, and I want to see if we can get a high refresh rate experience here, or max it out at 120 frames per second. So not with that, and not with that either. So the only way you can max it out is on low. DLSS ultra performance. Let's see performance. All right, so DLSS ultra performance with frame generation enabled on the low preset is the only way you can get 120 frames per second. This game would be perfectly playable at 60 frames per second depending on your own personal preference. A lot of people don't want to play at 60 frames per second. I'm kind of in that camp. 60 frames per second would be my minimum, but I would definitely try and aim for more than that. And the frame rate sitting at around 120 frames per second here with frame generation enabled means that the input latency is actually not that terrible. Let's see, can I actually block this bear? I'm going to kill this bear. There we go. At least the loading times are very, very quick. And I can't see. Anyway, that's Pax Dei early access for you. Just wanted to show you what kind of performance you can expect. Not to say that this would be the final performance once the game releases, but I know that there are quite a few people willing to or wanting to jump into this game, and just wanted to show you what kind of performance you can get. All right, thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.